Chris.
So we will have a few remarks by Chris Sands from the Hudson Institute. Please, Chris. How about a hand for Chris, please?
Good morning. It's very nice to be here. I have to say, last night was exciting. I came in and I just had a chance to catch, I don't know how many of you have been following television this season. There's a brand new show that's on. It's one of those nurses shows. It's called Mercy. And it's on, I think, NBC or one of those networks, and it's on. And it's a show of great interest to me, not because I'm interested in nurses particularly. It's fine. But one of the things they did in this show is that they have this character who is a California surfer dude who went to Iraq to serve as a doctor in with the U.S. Army, came back to New Jersey because he was madly in love with this nurse who was also a veteran, and he's described in the publicity material as eye candy for the show, because it's really a show about the nurses. Well, as it happens, perhaps quite appropriately, they decided to name this character Dr. Chris Sands. I'm not kidding. And this has led to no end of jokes. And my students use the show as something of a drinking game, unfortunately. So every time they say, "Oh, Dr. Sands," then they drink. So of course, when I arrived at the Kansas City airport and there was a lady with a sign that said Chris Sands waiting at the end of the plane, I was expecting perhaps screaming teenagers, some sense of excitement. Didn't get that, but I am glad that at least now people will have some other association with me and not keep saying, "You look just like the PC guy from the commercials." So I'm making my way up here in Kansas City. I'm here today filling in for Robert Bonner, the Customs Commissioner, and I want to talk a little bit about borders, which is really his expertise. Judge Bonner was, as many of you know, Customs Commissioner when September 11, the 9/11 attacks occurred, came at this as a former federal judge with a lot of expertise and brought some real energy and ideas to trying to respond to that event and make sure our borders were secure. And some years later, as it turns out, about 18 months ago, there was a group that tried to put together a look at how we were doing now that we were in a new administration or anticipating a new administration, looking at how well we were managing our borders. And in particular, the mandate was take a look at the Canada-US border, which many people say works somewhat better than the US-Mexico border, and see what we can learn about what is and isn't working there. So the Brookings Institution, which is, as many of you know, a very well-regarded institution on the center left in Washington, paired up with the Hudson Institute, my organization, which is on the center right, to try to put together a scholarly study of what was going on the northern border. And it was this work that caught Steve Blank's attention, got me invited here. Unfortunately, he did not know about this television show. Stephen's very hip, but he did not apparently follow the new TV season, so he invited me for that reason. And because we're talking North America, I took another look at all of this work to try to see how much I could distill from a discussion of the Canada-US experience for all of our land borders. For those of you who are interested in a little bit more on the study, it's available for free, which is the best price of all, on the Brookings website, which is www.brookings.edu, but it's also available on my website, which is www.hudson.org. It's an old debate about whether think tank should be EDU or ORG, and we're on the org side and they're on the EDU side. So what can I tell you about the border? First, what we found, in particular with regard to the Canadian border, and I do think that this is relevant to our US-Mexican border, is that there are a lot of problems at the border, but there is no crisis. Now that's very important because when you're talking about trying to reform or change the border, when you have a state of crisis, this is a call for urgent action, blank slate, go back to the drawing board, really put some resources in. But you don't have the palpable sense of crisis that we did after September 11 today at the borders. That doesn't mean there aren't problems, but it means the urgency that we once brought to our border issues has abated a bit. And this means from a moving forward point of view, we're more likely to succeed with incremental improvements than with sweeping improvements. And we use that as an assumption at the outset of this study to try to focus on what the nature of these problems were. The first problem that we identified, which I think is true universally at the border, is that we've centralized so much decision-making in the Department of Homeland Security in Washington now, all as part of trying to unite several very different organizations under a new umbrella. It was a very large challenge. But by centralizing all those organizations under one umbrella, we also centralized a lot of decision-making. And we found when we went from port to port, customs port to customs port, different crossings, that what we had before September 11 was a fair amount of autonomy at the local level to adjust to local conditions and work with local authorities to try to develop a border that worked for the users of that particular port. But under the DHS decentralization program, so many of the decisions that used to be able to be made locally now had to go to Washington to be vetted before they could be adopted. And that slowed down a lot of decision making. It also led us to a second observation. The Department of Homeland Security, after September 11, talked briefly, or I guess we'd say the White House at this point after September 11, talked briefly with Canada in particular about a perimeter approach to security. Screening things before they got to North America so that our Canada-US border, in which the US had underinvested in infrastructure for a long time and had too few personnel, wouldn't need to be bulked up. In fact, we could just shift the focus to the perimeter and we would avoid some of the problems on the bilateral border. But the Canadian government at the time, Prime Minister Jean Chrétien felt, based on his polling, that this would really frighten the Canadians, like being locked in a cage with an angry USA, and they didn't really want to go down the perimeter road. From that came, out of the Office of Homeland Security, which was the predecessor for the department, a model for handling our borders, which is sometimes referred to at DHS as the one border argument. And that is that wherever you enter the United States, whether it's an airport pre-clearance facility in Canada or Europe, or perhaps it's a seaport where you come in on a cruise ship, or you're coming in on a land border, wherever you come, however you enter, you face the same level of scrutiny as you enter, so that there's one uniform border. And when it comes to the land border, the argument was we need to have one land border. There can be no low points in the fence, because the low points are obviously the points at which someone will try to hop over the fence. So we have to have a high border standard that is universal. The problem with the one border approach, however, is it tried to make the border uniform, but it became a one-size-fits-all approach to the border. And the more you look at the land border with Canada, and it's also true with Mexico, the more you discover that it's the border's diversity, its heterogeneity, that actually makes it quite interesting. And one-size-fits-all doesn't work. It hasn't worked well, and many of the problems that we focused on in the report come down to a failure to adapt a universal rule to local conditions that were quite different. And a third problem that we identified that is a little more understandable, but one that nonetheless is very real, is the challenge of new personnel. We've dramatically increased the number of officers working on our northern and southern border, both Border Patrol, Customs, etc. Now, some of you will remember, if you've lived along the border, I did growing up in Detroit, that in the old days, when Customs wanted a raise, when they didn't like their working conditions, they couldn't strike. So what they would do is announce a work-to-rule program, where they would enforce every regulation that they had on the books and inspect everything to the highest standard. And what happened was the border slowed down to a crawl, there were big backups, and they only usually had to do that for a week or so when the governments would cave in and give them a raise or whatever it was they wanted. And Canada Customs did that, US Customs did that. That was a very common labor action technique. The problem that we have today is that we've brought a lot of new people into the border to work at the border who have backgrounds in criminal justice, law enforcement, perhaps were in the National Guard. They're very talented, bright young people, but they have no experience working the border. They're brand new. And when you're brand new, you don't know, you don't have that experience and judgment to say, okay, well, this is the rule, but I'm looking at this situation, I don't need to worry about that. Here's how I'm going to focus on what I need to focus on at this particular point of inspection with this particular truck or this particular family in a minivan. They don't have the judgment yet. So as a result, what we find a lot of the problems of the border are coming from young officers working to rule. Not because they're on strike, but because they're trying to make sure they're enforcing the regulations by the book, because they're all new and they're trying to figure out how to make that work. That's the learning curve. We talked about a smart border with Canada and a smart border with Mexico. But as some of you with kids know, you can have smart kids, but then you have to educate them. We have smart borders, but they need to get an education in how to actually operate. Otherwise, they're just precocious. And a precocious border is not what we had in mind. So we came with those sort of observations about what wasn't working, and that's very general, but just to give you a sense. We focused on 3 types of recommendations, which I hope will give us something to talk about here in the panel, for how we could make improvements now that we have a new administration taking a look at the border, inheriting a legacy from the Bush administration. But the Obama team has taken a very open approach to taking a look at what's going on the border. They have not abandoned. I know some Canadians who I know well were really hoping we would go back to the pre-Bush border. Obama would make all those scary things go away. That's not going to be the case. We're still there with border infrastructure. But we tried to come up with recommendations that would allow us to make incremental improvements on the border that we have today. 3 types. The first was a recommendation to go back to greater decentralization. This is very typical of Americans. We tend to go whole hog on an idea, and then we need to swing back the pendulum to a sort of moderate middle. Post-September 11, we centralized things at DHS. Now we need to go back and just decentralize a bit. Now, I've had this debate with some people who've asked, are you suggesting that the states should run the border? No. I'm suggesting that local feds are in a better position to assess local conditions by working with local communities. Not just at the port, but at the corridors, the trade corridors that feed the port, that are part of the constituency. Each port has different users. If you look at Detroit, Windsor as an important crossing, Detroit, Windsor has a lot of manufacturing users because of the auto industry. But if you go to Blaine, Washington, you find that you have far fewer manufacturers. You have softwood lumber producers, you have tourists. And so they require different programs. FAST is very popular in Detroit. You see a lot of FAST compliant truckers. You see a lot of members, people who've gone to the trouble to join CT-PAT at Detroit. You see far fewer out on the West Coast. But on the West Coast, you see very high participation of people in the Nexus program, people in Trusted Traveler, and they've taken to enhanced driver's licenses because they have individual crossers who find that works for them. That's the kind of variety that we need. And yet you have crossings that are trying to maintain an open Nexus lane and don't have commuters. Or they have commuters in a couple of spots during the day, in the morning and the afternoon, and nobody in the middle of the day, but often are told, keep a booth open just in case. Well, it's a waste of resources. The port directors know that, but DHS is trying to keep the border uniform and make sure these programs are available everywhere. It's not an efficient use of resources. By decentralizing and giving our officers, our port directors, our border patrol people, the ability to adjust, we can have a better functioning border. I'll give you an example of something that we found in our interviews. Very nice woman who is the port director out in Seattle, Tacoma for the Blaine, Washington crossing. She came to us and she was telling us about how well she was doing in preparation for the 2010 Olympics, the Winter Olympics coming up in February. She was going to make sure every one of the 10 booths that she had was staffed with an officer 24/7 for the 2 weeks of the Olympics to make sure that she could get people across the land border. So we asked the question, where are you getting all the officers from? And she said, well, I'm pulling them from the airport. But a lot of people are going to fly to Seattle in order to drive up. So we said, well, how are you going to handle the crowds at the airport? She said, well, that's the only place I can pull from. Now, the old customs, she could have called Miami. She could have found, other people who have, maybe no Olympics going on and could loan her some officers. But now, who's going to put them up? Who's going to pay their per diem at a local hotel? Where are you going to find space for them now that there are so many people coming in for the Olympics? Well, it's a budgetary issue, it's a management issue, but the only thing she can do is go to DHS headquarters and file a request for resources and hope it works out. Well, that's an inefficient way to run the border. Give her empowerment. Let her borrow from her neighbor custom port directors. Let them have the resources to try these things out. We don't do that now. We have a top-down approach, and allowing that the port directors take the lead would make a big difference. But there's another problem. Our port directors and deputy port directors are cycling very fast. Some of them hit a port and they stay for a year and a half or less. It's not enough. As with consuls general or other diplomats, other people in posts, they need to stay 3 or 4 years. And they really need to be told part of your promotion is how well you get out and talk to your Chamber of Commerce, how well you talk to community groups, not just in the city you live in, but the cities that feed your port. So you really know your community and you know what their needs are and you're talking to them and you stay there long enough to implement change, not just for a quick flyby. And I think that that's something that has to do with the way DHS personnel is managed, but something we could usefully do in the near term. And I think would affect Mexico as much as it would affect the Canadian border. Second recommendation, we need to start being more precise when we talk about the border. It's a great temptation to say, I have a problem at the border and it affects the whole border because I'm having trouble getting grandmas across the border to buy prescription drugs from Canada and it's causing a whole mess. Well, maybe you do have that problem in a particular place, but assuming that it affects the whole border has been a problem because we've exaggerated problems and made them, as we used to say, we've made a federal case out of them. So the DHS then needs to debate things, Congress weighs in. We'd be much smarter to try to solve the problems locally in a small way. And this leads me to the second thing I think that we could usefully do about being precise, and that is approach the border in the spirit of pilot projects. Those of you who've been working around borders for a while know. The enhanced driver's license was a pilot project. It started in Washington State, was proven to work. They did all the tests, gathered the data, and then it went border-wide. Some of you will remember that CT PAT had its origins in a program in Detroit between the auto companies and customs, trying to implement the ACE, the Automated Customs Environment System. They developed a supply chain security approach that would work pretty well for auto manufacturers, and that's why they're among the big users of CT PAT and FAST. But we've seen this innovation occur in this way before. We need to enable it and empower it. There should be a federal pilot project fund to put federal matching money or just federal money into the hands of local community people to try great ideas that come from the community and see if they work. That means documenting them, getting the data, but then taking those ideas nationwide if they're good. I think this is part of giving those local federal authorities the ability to make the border better, both by listening, but then having the ability to do things. That leads me to another recommendation having to do with precision, and that is we need to stop thinking of one border. Not only one border in the DHS sense, but also stop fooling ourselves into thinking that the Canada-US border is a thing. It's actually a collection of diverse regions, and they have different needs. They have different users of different types of crossings. The rural border, where you have small crossings that often have issues because they're not open 24/7, or in fact they may only be open 8 hours a day for 5 days a week, and their biggest issue is service. And the DHS microport strategy consolidating ports raises a lot of concerns for people, particularly at seasonal harvest times or other times when traffic does peak or the tourist season. We have big crossings like Detroit-Windsor that have infrastructure issues. They need a bridge, or 2 bridges, or 3 bridges. We'll see how many bridges they get at the end of the day. But those are very specific problems, not problems of the whole border. And we need to recognize that they're different. At the same time, the Mexican border is quite diverse. We need to recognize that our borders are not necessarily chained at the hip. We can develop best practice at either border and then take that idea around wherever it applies. But treating the borders as a monolith is a problem in both directions. A problem of too much uniformity coming from DHS, but also a problem on our part, because sometimes we assume greater commonality than there exists. Last recommendation. I think that the purpose of all of this cleanup work is to clear out the underbrush of small problems that have led us to not see a consensus at the border moving forward. And as Stephen alluded to in his opening remarks, without a sense of where we're going, we don't have the ability to pull together and get there. As some of you will know, Canada-US Free Trade and NAFTA were different trade agreements than many of what we'd seen before. Different in one particular way. And that is that while the auto companies had the Auto Pact, defense companies had the Defense Production Sharing Agreement, we had various deals for large firms. Canada-US Free Trade and NAFTA opened up trade in North America to small and medium-sized enterprises. And the small and medium-sized enterprises who grew dramatically in the 80s and 90s and in the early 2000s were the fuel for the growth in trade in North America. They were the fuel for the integration in North America, but they are at a disadvantage when it comes to these North American debates because they are small and medium-sized enterprises. fragmented, perhaps part of associations, part of groups, trying to get their voice heard. But sometimes if they face a lot of paperwork, if they face a lot of challenge, their attitude is, I can't change the whole border. I can't fix this. It's too big. I'm just not going to do trade with Canada anymore. I'm going to pull back. And that kind of giving up, not for the people in this room, but for many people is hurting our ability to fix the border. That's why acting locally, which is much more plausible for them, offers us more hope. If we can think again about our future vision, if we can begin to correct the problems for the small participants in the border, the small and medium-sized enterprises, and the communities that are affected by border changes, we can start looking to things like North American labor mobility, not citizenship change, not the immigration debate, but to say you should have a right to work anywhere in North America. Unemployed auto workers in Detroit going to help build the oil sands in Alberta. People in the Midwest able to participate anywhere in the Canadian economy or the Mexican economy, but without changing citizenship. We could start talking about the perimeter again. Janet Napolitano, our Secretary of DHS, has opened up the idea of talking about perimeter, but to get there we have to clear out a lot of underbrush. But maybe we should open the borders a little bit more in North America, trust each other more, and screen things before they even get here. It would be an approach much more like Europe, but it's doable, but it's only doable if we can clear out some of these problems first. So with that, let me stop. I'm just going to turn it over to this border panel and apologize up front because I know I didn't spend enough time on Mexico, but hopefully these guys will school us on the Mexican side. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those insightful comments. We just kind of launched in, and I should have given you a proper introduction. Chris Sands is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Let me back up a little bit and say that what we're going to do here is we're part of the morning session, which deals with ports and borders. Does security still trump trade? And the way that we're going to do this is that we have a distinguished panel here. And I will be the moderator. So I am Roberto Garcia. I'm Clinical Associate Professor of International Business, and I'm the co-director of the Supply Chain and Global Management Academy at Indiana University. It's a pleasure to be here and to be representing our CIBER. We have a distinguished panel here. We have Ron LeMieux to my left. He is the Minister of Transportation in the Manitoba Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure. Next to him, we have Roger Scarbrough. He's the president of Scarbrough International out of Kansas City. And then we have Professor Alejandro Ibarra-Yunez he's a professor of economics and public policy from the Monterrey Institute of Technology. You may know it as the Tecnológico de Monterrey. He's here with us. And then we have Chris Gutierrez, president of Kansas City Smart Port. How about a hand to welcome our panelists, please? All right. And I have been given the task of moderating the session, so I will direct questions at them, and then we'll keep the conversation flowing. Until, Stephen, how long do we go for this session? To 10:15. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin. So I will, let me go back up here. I think that would be better. So I will direct this to any of the panelists, and then we'll go from there. What do you see are the challenges in developing a common border security agenda for the three partners, the three countries here? We heard from Chris some of the issues in developing a common vision. What do you think are the challenges to developing a common agenda? Can we start with you, Minister LeMieux?
Well, thank you very much, and welcome everyone. It's always a pleasure to be here, and certainly representing the province of Manitoba in Canada. This is a truly important discussion for us. We are a small province. We're in the center of Canada. We truly depend on trade with the United States, and yet our trade is growing with China and India and Russia. But the United States for us is still our main trading partner. And issues related to cross-border trade, any kind of holdups at the border in any way, shape, or form is looked upon by a number of businesses in our province certainly as being a negative, and also businesses coming into our country or goods being transported into Canada via our border crossing at Pembina Emerson is indeed looked upon as a problem as well. After 9/11, we all felt the pressures with regard to tightening of security. We know that security is not just a trend, it's not a negotiable, it's a non-negotiable requirement in every aspect of our lives, and certainly in industries as well. And we're trying to work as best as we can, certainly with our federal government, our federal counterparts, in trying to improve our border crossing. And we are working with the state below us, North Dakota, and we're pursuing a study currently and how we can make our border crossing more efficient. Chris, there was a number of different comments that were made that I certainly really appreciated when you're talking about centralization of decision making and how frustrating that can be for a province trying to deal with our federal counterparts and trying to impress upon them our unique situation. We have about 30 small crossings in Manitoba, and yet Pembina Emerson crossing is the 5th largest crossing in our country. It's the largest cross-border crossing with truck traffic west of the Great Lakes. It's the largest in Western Canada. So we are feeling, I wouldn't say isolated, but when we're trying to make our case with Ottawa and trying to make our case with other regulators, we're trying to express our own uniqueness and what Manitoba's like and what our crossings are like. They're not all large crossings, but we do have one large one, and we're trying to get as much cooperation as we can from our federal government. But just on some of the comments that you made with regard to training of staff, we see that at our own crossing, our major crossing at Pembina Emerson, where there is a rotation of staff often, and it's done too quickly. The people don't have a lot of experience and are moving fairly quickly through there. On the infrastructure and transportation side, we've tried to improve that crossing. As I mentioned, we're looking at a study not only to improve the border crossing itself, but how do we both work to enhance truck crossing as well as just ordinary vehicle crossings for tourism, for example. How do you have specific lanes for trucks and so on? And it's something that we really appreciate working with North Dakota on, because we feel that that's the only way this is going to work, because they also have their challenges being a small province to the south of us. So just on that, I know others want to make a comment, but I do really appreciate the comments that you made, because we're facing a lot of those challenges, but also some of the recommendations you made, I believe, are quite appropriate to our particular province. So I'd certainly be wanting to hear others comment on their views on, at least to get the discussion started.
Sure. Alex, I would be interested in your approach. What do you see are the challenges to developing a common vision among the three partners?
Well, first of all, I think that after NAFTA was launched, and in which the three federal governments were very much involved in launching NAFTA, now after 15 years of having begun NAFTA, because we just finished the beginning, after 15 years of deunification, the issue is not in the high priorities. Whereas our president has one topic in mind: security, domestic security. The U.S. administration has about 50 topics in their mind, and President Obama has many, many topics in their mind. And out of those 50, I think that U.S.-Mexico relations are not in those 50. And so with that in mind, it is very difficult to have an interface of understanding and a common vision for North America. The Canadians also have a different vision nowadays than 15 years ago when NAFTA was launched. So we need a multifaceted approach from top down on the one hand, but as Chris was saying, and very well said, the constituents and the stakeholders of NAFTA are the businesses that when SPP was started in 2006, it was only government discussions, and the stakeholders who are the traders, the trucking companies, the manufacturing sector, the agricultural sector, services, were not taken into account. So that has to be changed too. I think that after 9/11, Mexican companies suffered from stoppage of trade that lasted about 4 months. After 4 months of buffer times that were totally outrageous, and just-in-time interfaces were very much disrupted, we attained business as usual. However, the cost of certification, CityPad responses, e-pediments, treatment of cargo in not only the ports of entry but at the plant level, has been very, very costly to companies. I did a study trying to calculate the tariff equivalent of for the Mexican companies regarding security. And it came out to be between 9 and 13 ad valorem tariff, which would place them out of the market. So the cost was borne by the companies, not the governments. The governments have to bear a cost of coordination, but very, very few initiatives have been successful in attaining this secure but safe border. However, I have to say that and place the question to the different sites that are watching us. What are issues in your own region, in your own CIBER, that drive the businesses, public policy or public decision making, and also research topics in universities? Because the border is very heterogeneous. The Laredo border has to deal with a lot of crossings and lack of infrastructure, warehousing. Whereas the Calexico-Mexicali border has a totally different paradigm around water management. And the Juarez-El Paso border is very much worried about the downturn of the maquiladoras and drug trafficking. So the U.S.-Mexico border is also very heterogeneous, as you were saying, Ron, about the Canada-U.S. Canada-U.S. border. And I think that, on the other hand, there have been successful stories, not only bad stories. One example is the Merida Initiative, which implies a cooperation at the highest ranks of government between the U.S. and Mexico regarding security in the military. Another successful story occurred in last April when the H1N1 outburst of influenza hit Mexico, and then Mexico, the U.S., and then the rest of the world cooperated in order to have an inventory and a common treatment of the outburst. That is also successful. Appropriations in the U.S. federal budget have occurred regarding water management and cooperation. And I'm right now studying the opportunities for electricity transmission lines across the borders. And electricity trade, which has a lot of potential. And so not everything is negative. However, I think that for now the three countries in their highest levels of government have to come together again to relaunch a vision for North America as a region. and we have not had that.
Okay. Roger, I would be interested in your in your perspective, from the business perspective. How would you address the challenges in developing a common agenda?
Well, thank you, Roberto. I think it's important. It was my understanding that each of us were going to do 3 or 4 minutes of the overall issue, and I think that's important from the perspective issue, because I'm in the industry. Actually, I would be interested in polling the audience. How many of you are in education? How many are in government or economic development? How many of you actually move freight in NAFTA? Okay, so there's a few of us. So my perspective is significantly different than that of either Ron or Alex, because theirs is from the macro sense of how do they help their countries to do it. My responsibility is to keep my customers' freight moving every day, every minute, every hour, and I don't care and give a damn about what their economic development councils are doing and what their governments are doing. You know, understanding that we have to deal in that issue and that there are many issues, and we could get off on that for an hour, but let me give you just for a moment this perspective. I'm a fundamentalist. I believe that we solve these issues one shipment at a time. I totally agree with Chris's comments about we need to let the local people deal with the local issues, because the federal government, quite honestly, none of them get it. None of them have the answers, and quite honestly, it's really irrational of us to think that they will. So why do I mean, one of the definitions of insanity is keeping doing the same thing and expecting different results. So the real question is, what are the academic communities and what are the business communities going to do that are going to change how governments address this issue? And that's really what we have to do. If we can't build a consensus of economic cooperation and make the governments understand that that has to be the driving force, then we'll never conquer the security issue. And the security issue is really a very simple one if you leave it that way. Everyone has to take personal accountability for their own freight. And if we've learned one lesson from 9/11, it's that if we know who the shipper is and if we know what they ship, we've gone a long ways toward security. We don't have to inspect every piece of cargo. And I don't want to be politically incorrect, but quite honestly, profiling works. If we know who the people are, and we know what they ship, and we know that they're a legitimate business, then we don't have to pay too much attention to them. But if we don't know who they are, and we don't know what they're shipping, and we don't know what their patterns are or their commitment to supply chain security, then by golly, we need to pay attention. The worst thing that's happened to us is last month, a bunch of people who were CTPAT certified got their shipments busted. Now, how are you going to build a security program when there's no personal accountability for the people that have dedicated themselves and made the commitment to a secure supply chain and a partnership against terrorism? Those people ought to be in trouble. Those people ought to be, I won't say banished or prohibited from trading, but they certainly should be used as an example. So again, the issues are real. The local thing is here, but from industry point of view, everybody has to take the responsibility. And the biggest problem that we have is the commitment by the individual shippers and the individual companies. And again, my experience has shown it's the foreign companies. The Europeans, as an example, don't understand importer security filing, don't think they should have to comply. It's another one of those stupid United States rules that they don't believe in. But the truth of the matter is, until we can figure out a way to get them to commit and every shipment to be in compliance and to work with that as a personal commitment from a company, you can't solve the rest of the issues, in my opinion. So, slightly different perspective.
Okay. Chris Gutierrez, would you like to give your overview, please?
Well, you know, I had some thoughts, but I almost said pass after hearing Roger's comments. But, and I didn't know which hand to raise in Roger's questions, because Smartport is definitely a group of industry representatives that move freight, but we're also an economic development group, and we're very involved in policy, so I just didn't raise my hand at all. But I think Roger hit it great for me, and I'll keep mine brief, because these guys, I told Roger once they get to me, everything will be said. But the way to move forward with this discussion is stop talking about security. I think you need to talk about industry, you need to talk about freight movement. You know, the adage people say, freight at rest is freight at risk. I mean, all of these policies, all these programs are delaying shipments and movement of people, which causes more concern. Chris hit some great points to localize it, to look at pilot projects, but unfortunately that is not really accepted at the government levels, because that gets bogged down into how do we treat one area versus the other, and the kind of the United Nations diplomatic, we've got to make it equal for everybody. And I think that's where some of the issues rise. And he also mentioned the ex-Commissioner Bonner, who was the chair or co-chair of a Mexican-U.S. border discussion, who I think, if you've read their report, made some great recommendations to move forward, but their number one section, as they read past the executive summary, was security. Number two was facilitation. I think that's the problem. I think Roger hit it. If you allow freight and industry to regulate themselves, the bad apples will show themselves very quickly, and you'll resolve those issues. I mean, industry adapted to CTPAT very strongly because they were self-regulating themselves somewhat to make sure that their freight, as Roger said, his job and industry's job is to make sure freight moves 24/7, 365 days a year. You put programs in place to hinder that, they're going to self-correct it to make sure the freight moves, because that's what industry has to do, and security will follow that. We have a unique project here in Kansas City called the Kansas City Customs Facility that I think everybody's heard me talk about in the past, that was allowing industry to leapfrog away from the border issues at the Mexican border that are inherently inefficient, to bring them to the Kansas City market, where both U.S. and Mexican customs cooperate to move freight more efficiently southbound. And as Stephen said earlier, unfortunately we got tangled into everything related to other things, and that project kept getting delayed and delayed. And every time we'd make a movement, someone on one side of the country would retire or be reelected, and we'd have to start all over again. That's where we are today. Today we don't have a U.S. Commissioner of Customs, so we're not moving that project. But it was a project about moving freight more efficiently south into Mexico, would automatically have security benefits, because you would know that freight, as Chris said, before it reached the border, kind of the one border discussion. So I think that's a great point as well. But I'll stop with that. I think you've heard some great points. I mean, it's about making sure freight moves, people move, and the security is always a byproduct of that, and it'll solve itself. If you lead with security, I always joke, if you lead with security, industry takes 2 steps back, because that means costs. It doesn't mean moving their freight more efficiently, which they will adapt to and give you that security benefit.
Okay. Would any of the other panelists like to add more to their overview? Let's say their comments that they had prepared. Please, Ron.
Well, I certainly would. I really do appreciate the comments made about where government stands and compared to industry, and I think it's hugely, it's imperative that government, no matter what level of government you are, to have the discussions with the people that are actually in the business of moving freight, and people who are actually the business people that really depend on the kind of rules and regulations that are put in place. In Manitoba, we have the Manitoba Trucking Association, we have the Chambers of Commerce of Manitoba, the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce. Dave Angus is here as a representative, and we have people who are in the business. It's their bread and butter, and they depend on what that border crossing is all about. And in Manitoba, I know, let me just speak from my perspective. I was the Minister of Transportation, or Infrastructure and Transportation, not the Minister of Trade. But yet the impact that transportation had on trade was huge. For example, in my trips to Mexico and having conversations with people in Guanajuato or in Nuevo Leon in Monterrey, speaking to a company I believe is called Castores, in a large trucking company in Guanajuato. Their challenges were the same challenges that the trucking association and the trucking companies, and we have 5 of the 10 largest trucking companies in Canada are located in Winnipeg, because we are in the center of our country. But having said that, their challenges were the same as the trucking companies in Manitoba and in Canada. They were really frustrated with the kind of, I think, overburdening kind of regulations they felt were being put on them. Some companies were doing a great job of being trying to be as secure as possible, well-trained drivers. They also had brand new trucks. They had the most updated equipment, and I'm referring to Mexico now, but they kept saying in frustration that when they tried to get into the U.S., they found all kinds of roadblocks. So here you have a small country of Canada, a small country of Mexico. We have our larger neighbor in the center, which we really depend on for trade. And what I found really interesting in my travels is that a lot of our concerns and challenges, but also opportunities, are very, very similar. And it certainly was an eye-opener to me when I met with a number of the trucking companies in Mexico to hear them wanting our support in a way to speak to the U.S. government. That's what they were asking us to do. They're saying, is there anything Manitoba can do? Is there anything Canada can do? Because you have the same challenges. Can we work together? But the point was made before that the people that have to be consulted is the industry, the people who are in logistics, the people who are freight movers, people who make their bread and butter from that type of industry. And I don't think there's enough of that happening, quite frankly, from governments. And it just creates a lot of frustration. And frustration, of course, for many of the companies also leads to them pulling back. And it means less trade, and it means less efficiencies all around, I believe. But I know there's a number of comments. I won't take all the oxygen out of the room, but a lot of good points were made by all the panel on the type of things that we're all seeing in our different walks of life, and many, many similarities, no matter what country we're in. And we really need to get our act together, really as a North American continent, on how we're going to make some changes, because it's been a while now since 9/11. And now we've had a chance to see what has taken place since then, and I believe there's a lot of room for improvement. So maybe I'll just keep my comments at that for now.
Okay. Alex, do you want to add anything more?
No, I'll pass the word to my colleagues.
Okay.
I mean,
Chris Sands, can I ask you to comment then? You sort of brought up the issue of developing the common agenda and creating a common vision. Can you give us your thoughts on that? How can this be accomplished?
Sure. Well, I wish I had all the answers. Think tank people just say they have all the answers. They really don't. And we're in the education sector, except we have some of the most challenged students, special needs students around, because usually we're trying to work with congressmen, and it's very difficult sometimes. You have to want to learn. That's the thing. Anyway, just a couple of observations. I think sometimes when you focus on the border by user type, who's using the border, you realize something important, and that is one of the things that's happened since NAFTA is that we've become big energy traders, oil, gas, electricity. This is a growing area. But the energy companies have a different experience of the border. When we could rely on automotive as our biggest component of North American trade, sometimes 40% or more, and all of the things that go with cars, the auto companies were vertically organized, lobbied well, pretty good at making sure the border worked because it was in their bottom line interest, but they had a lot of clout. Mm-hmm. The energy companies cross the border in a pipeline or a power line. They don't run into an inspector. Nobody stops their product. And so while they have issues in terms of permitting new infrastructure to get across the border, I mean, they don't have no issues. That's significant. Their experience is so different that here's this group of firms with a lot of clout now, but they're not lobbying on our issues because they have such a different experience. I think that's something that we have to take into account and maybe find a way to get them into our coalitions thinking a little bit. Maybe we have to support them getting their permitted infrastructure done, but recognize that we depend on their energy to keep running our industry, and so maybe see if we can't find common cause as a first step. A second group that I think is often one of our big challenges are the amateur crossers. I'm not putting them down, but if you talk to congressmen about what they think about the border, they will tell you again and again about the story of constituent A who had a bad experience when they crossed the border with kids in the minivan and didn't know they all needed passports, and it took them a couple hours to get through, and the customs people are just so rude. Now that's happened probably to all of us at one point or another, but the problem for the amateur crosser, unlike business goes over a lot often. And Alex and I were talking about this during the session. One of the things we found with the border is that it keeps changing. I wish we could say that we had a post 9/11 change and we've just been getting used to it, but sometimes the policies out of DHS have changed every 6 months, or even more often, with new programs, new procedures, new computer systems, so it can be very hard to keep up. If you're an amateur crosser, you go up to Canada every once in a while, maybe you've got family there, but you haven't seen them in a bit, or you have a tourist destination that, with the economy being down, you might not have gotten to in the last couple of years, but you'd like to go. You haven't paid attention to any of this debate, so you don't know what you need. And you show up at the border, backing up traffic, confused, rattled, irritated, and quick to complain when things go wrong. The border policymakers focus a lot of energy on those people, but we don't do a great job in travel and tourism communicating with them, reaching them and saying, listen, before you get to the border, get your act together and it'll be really smooth. We're still at the stage that the Transportation Security Administration is, where all of a sudden you wake up one morning and the Weather Channel tells you need to have all your fluids in little bottles, and so people scramble around trying to find little bottles. We're doing a very bad job of public communication with that sector, but it affects all the rest of us. So, Roberto, to come back to your question, I think that we are a very fragmented set of border users, both for North and South, and that there have got to be ways that we can bring more people into the tent. And the first step, I think, for business and industry people using the border a lot is to recognize these other groups that aren't us are necessary to getting something changed. And we've got to bring in the energy people. We've got to reach out to the amateurs. We've got to make sure everybody's taken care of in order to get the border going. And one last point, and this is just an observation. Again and again, you see the statistics, you look at the way that we talk about the border, it's all port-oriented. Where are you crossing? What's your gateway? Right? But the trade corridors that link the gateways are often invisible to policymakers. They don't see how the trade flows. So Kansas City, this goes to your point, Chris, Kansas City isn't on the border. So what does it have to do with border policy? Because it's in the middle. Well, it has a lot to do with border policy, but people don't see it. And this is, can I make a data recommendation? This is a very nerdy thing, but I have the microphone, so I have to say it. This is how you'll know I'm not the hunky doctor, because I'm making this recommendation. But with all of the data that we now collect at the border, with electronic manifests and so on, if you look at our trade data from the Department of Commerce, they try to do state export data, a little bit of state import data, but it's pretty rudimentary. Yep. And why? Because they count it when it enters. So Michigan and Texas are big traders with Canada and Mexico because that's where things enter. And so the data looks like that, and so the response from Congress and everyone else is, well, okay, those are the big trading states, that's what we need to know. But in fact, we now are collecting data from shippers, so we know the dollar value of everything that's shipped from that truck as it drops things off as it moves through the country, and it may be moving from Canada to Mexico and not dropping that much off in the U.S., because Mexico is where the consumption is going to take place. So we're underestimating and not appreciating the trade patterns, but the data is right there. So this is my humble recommendation. Those of you who remember the New Deal, we're all too young for the New Deal, but you remember hearing about it in school. The New Deal, we had the Works Project Administration. We had a rural workforce. We could make them build roads. It was kind of brute labor. Now we have a recession, and a lot of our unemployed people are these Wall Street, financial weasels. What we should do is send them to the salt mines to go through the DHS bills of lading, the electronic manifests, to work all this data out for us, to redeem themselves in our eyes.
That'll reform them in a hurry.
Put them to shovel snow.
Alex?
Yes, building upon Chris's comment, I think that indeed, trade is one thing, ports of entry is another thing, and the border communities are another thing. So we have to piece out the three. Before coming to the conference, I thought that we were going to talk somewhat about security. And I was checking data on crime at the border, U.S. border cities, southern border cities and states. Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California. And I have the data on murder indices or rates and vehicle theft. And they are flat, I mean, or even going down. So the press or lay people talk about an increasing insecurity in your border towns of Brownsville, Laredo, McAllen, El Paso, Calexico, or San Diego. And at least the data, the hard data, say that no, there is not a problem of increasing crime rates in border cities. But indeed, there are problems on public works and government expenses to an increasing and fast-growing population in the borders. So that's a different story, a different topic from what we are talking about, security trumping trade, ports and borders. We are really talking about trade here in this table, rather than borders. And another comment or final remark here is that there are two visions about borders. A border is the door of your house, like the door of your house, to keep you safe inside and keep out the outsiders. There is one vision. The other vision is that a border is an opportunity to understand the others and integrate and accept the otherhood. And I think that we have to move from the first definition to the second.
Okay. Speaking about more directly about security, how did 9/11 change things, and what are the lessons that we've learned about border efficiency? Let's start with you, Roger.
Well, this gets back to the core issue of security. The truth is 9/11 changed everything, and everybody that's lived through it understands that. The question becomes, what do we do about it, and how do we maintain our trade? I mean, one of the goals of that attack was to destroy our economic system. We have to make sure that doesn't take place. I mean, we have to set fundamental goals to make sure that we're accomplishing what we really want to accomplish. I totally agree with Chris's comment about we need to clear out some of the small issues in the underbrush in order to get to the big things. I look at it from a slightly different perspective based on security, and the real truth of that is, what can we agree on? Let's take those lists first of what we can agree on. And I would even go so far as to say, let's get it down to 2 out of 3. If Canada and Mexico both agree that they're facing unreasonable hurdles to get their trucks into the United States, let's put that in the 2 out of 3 category. If they don't believe that, they should. But we have to overcome those issues after we've agreed on what's the 3 for 3. I think in the 3 for 3, there's one thing that we've all agreed on, is it has to be practical. I'll go back to the point that who you know when it crosses the border is a very important thing that we learned from 9/11. If we know who that shipper is, that's an important thing. I wrote an article a couple of months ago that's, I think, appropriate here. A funny thing happened on the way to security, and we have to bring this out. All of a sudden, it turned into a fundraising event. They think that they can put fees on every security bill. They think that they can have certifications and registrations and everything, and that business can simply afford to do all of those things, and that it's not going to have any effect because we're doing it in the name of security. I would hope that we could all agree that you can't just throw an endless amount of money and take it from the business people to fund the rest of the political agenda in the name of security. And if the business world and the academic world can stand up and say, okay, we're not going to keep paying fees in the name of security, but we believe in security, and here's what we all agree we can agree on. then maybe they have to listen to us instead of us having to react to the bills that they push through Congress that put $250,000 fines on people who happen to make a mistake in filling out a form. That's not security. So we have to, you know, in the Midwest terms, you get the wheat from the chaff and figure out what's real and what isn't real and shake the cost back out of this thing and agree, figure out what we can agree on and start there. Know who's trading and who isn't and deal with them separately, and then you can narrow it down.
Roger, let me just pick up on something there, and I wish I could claim this line, but if, I was at a session and one of the speakers made this point. I thought it was a very apt point, which is DHS needs to decide whether it is a domestic regulatory agency, you know, doing facilitation, keeping trade flowing, or whether they're in the national security business. If you ask the Pentagon, you ask the Defense Department to do cost recovery, well, the Romans used to do that. It's called looting and pillage. Now, it does work to keep the Army going, but it's not a good way to fund it. We've decided a long time ago the Army has to be funded because it's in the national interest. So we're funding DHS as if it's a domestic agency doing cost recovery with user fees and other things. It doesn't make sense. It's looting and pillaging ourselves in order to do the security. Now, I'm all for them getting funds, but why not do direct funds? And the problem that layers on top of that is their budget, because it's seen as domestic and not national security, although national security gets this too, it becomes a giant pork project. And so you look at what's the rational place to build ports and so on, and it really has to do with who's the best congressman or senator or who's got the most clout in the next election. And that's not the right way to do infrastructure either. So just to concur on your points, I think our funding model for some of this is part of the problem.
Chris Gutierrez, would you like to comment?
You know, the only thing I'll add, I think it's to the cyber groups that are here. It'd be an interesting study to see how much freight that crosses pick a border on crossing in the U.S. Canada, U.S. Mexico. How much is consistent? It's the same shipment from the same company every Thursday, and to see what that, I would guess that percentage is pretty high of the known shippers that are moving that. Like you talked about, the auto industry has a great efficient way to move freight. But I bet if you look at all of the freight that crosses in a given month at one of the border crossings, it's probably very consistent. And yet we're targeting, as Chris said, that one person at the airport who doesn't know he's supposed to take his shoes off when he goes through the machine, and everybody else waits for him. We're dealing to that 1% as opposed to the 80-20 rule, and we really should be dealing with that group that moves a majority of it. And again, I'll challenge one of the cyber schools or all of you to find out, do that study once and see what that is. And then another challenge, we've got a good, Roger said it, good Midwestern work ethic. Let us be the pilots to show how this can move forward, because we want to move trade. We're not caught up into the political and the you know, who's the best senator that can drive funds. We want to move freight on the NASCO corridor, and let's do those pilots here.
Alex, would you like to comment?
I remember that on September 11, Stephen Blank was in Monterrey. And that very moment, it was raining, it was pouring, you know? And he managed to leave Monterrey into Houston or Dallas, and you were stopped. You had to take the bus or something, you know? So the disruption of 9/11 was really horrendous, never seen, never felt. However, as I was saying, trade value returned to normal 4 months afterwards. The cost that had been put had to be paid by the shippers, by the industry, regarding certification and norms and all these security measures. But trade continued to exist. The Mexican government has to deal nowadays with the problem of domestic crime related to drug cartels that kill each other. You know? And I don't know the figure, I don't remember the figure, possibly Jose Luis will know the figure, but we have more killings than in Iraq. And so security in Mexico has another dimension, and that dimension is domestic crime. And the federal government has decided that it was to be its key point, because otherwise the economic disruption would be horrendous domestically. Now, regarding trade, remember that Mexico has a surplus trade balance with the U.S. I think the same as Canada. And so our northbound crossings are much more involved than our southbound backhaul crossings or import crossings. We have studied a lot the export side of the Mexican disruption after 9/11 and across the years, but we have not studied enough the import side. However, if you talk to the chambers of industry in Mexico, they will not feel bad. I mean, they will not tell you that there are problems in the import side, say Mexican customs or procedures or norms. However, norms and standards, I think that are very easily agreed upon, and what we face is that these norms and standards change too much. And so both shippers and industrials and exporters or importers feel very, very awkward by having to learn all these standards and norms every time.
Okay. Ron, would you like to provide the Canadian perspective?
Well, thank you. You know, after 9/11, there have been some successes. People understand how important security is to all of our countries, and quite frankly, we have looked at ways to improve. To be, maybe I'll give a comment on behalf of elected officials here that I believe that most elected officials really want to do the right thing. They're not just looking after their own backyard financially, but I believe many of them have to be still educated as to what the issues are, and also given some solutions. And sometimes elected officials are getting mixed messages from different sectors because, of course, that's in their interest, okay? I mean, you gave the example about electricity and energy and how that flows. But we have learned a lot, I believe. There have been some successes. I mean, if you take a look at the NASCO, since we're here dealing with NASCO, the NASCO had a pilot project called NAVTRAX. I can't remember exactly what that stands for, but it's really talking about how do you move product and ensure that it's secure by not only crossing states but also crossing into other countries. So we have the technology that has been improved since 9/11. It continues to be enhanced and improved. So we are, I believe, heading in the right direction on a number of fronts. But there, of course, are the negative sides to this as well, that the overburdening paperwork and so on that companies are expected to pick up and, of course, incur the cost as well. But we have, I believe, made some progress with regard to the security side. And does security trump trade? No. I believe that we can surely, in North America, whether it's in Mexico, Canada, the United States, work a lot closer together, the three NAFTA countries, to ensure that one, for example, security is not hindering trade and improving it. And yet we know we have to be secure. I mean, it can be a win-win, I believe, on both. It's not a matter of one trumping the other. And yet we want to continue working with our partners. I believe we still have to do more about sharing best practices. In Manitoba, we have a new president and CEO here of Centerport Canada. Diane Gray's here, and I know Diane will be speaking, I believe, in a couple of days. So our inland port is not on the border. Our port is about 100 kilometers north of the North Dakota, the 49th parallel, north of the border. So often people are talking about all these issues, about border issues. And yet for us, it's hugely important. What are we going to do to ensure that our inland port, Canada's only inland port, is going to be successful? And yet it's 100 kilometers removed from the US-Canada border. And for us, it's going to be hugely important on what do we do to ensure that cargo can move out of there. Can we have, Chris, you were talking about how, Chris Gutierrez, sorry, about the initiative here in Kansas City. You know, you're looking at having a customs facility, a customs agency on how you can pass things through at this level, because you have Kansas City Smartport. You want to be able to have your goods go into Mexico, for example, but not be held up at Laredo for day after day after day, and or going to Canada. So there are best practices we can share, and many of you in this room have far more examples, I'm sure, than I have, or that any one of the panelists up here have. And that's why it's important to have not only this discussion, but each and every one of you play an important role in this, because you're going to dialogue with the people beside you. And when people were putting up their hands of who you represent or what organization you represent, I think there were 3 or 4 people who actually were logistics people or shippers or trucking companies here. But it's important that all of us have this discussion, because it's truly important to all of our 3 countries and to all of the states on the corridor, on the Mid-Continent Trade and Transportation Corridor, which were all representatives in NASCO, and wanting to make sure that this really works for us. So I do really appreciate the conversation very much, and a lot of good comments were made, and I know there's others to be made, so I'm certainly open to this. But again, just let me just finish my train of thought on this, is that a lot of elected officials really, my experience has been, they want to know from industry, they want to know from other levels of government, they want to know from people that have to deal with the security and trade issues. They're looking for suggestions, and they're looking on ways to make it better, because it's in their own best interest to do so, but it's also in their country's best interest, no matter if they're politicians from Mexico, Canada, or the United States.
Okay,
Let me just
please.
second that. I mean, I don't mean to pick on politicians. It's just, one of the things we do in Washington when we're not politicians. But just to show that LeMieux is really serious. I mean, he's so serious about making sure that the right, political people who've got a good sense and get this business are in a leadership position. He sent his boss down to be the ambassador in Washington. Gary Dewar, some of you know, the former premier of Manitoba, is now the Canadian ambassador in Washington, and joins Arturo Saurocan, who's the first-class Mexican ambassador in Washington, and we have in the 2 of them a pretty good tag team of people who do understand these issues. And so there is a window of opportunity, I think, that we've got now, which is maybe something we didn't have 6 months ago, which is pretty nice.
Yeah.
Are there lessons from other borders around the world, in other parts of the world, where we can take those lessons and apply those to the NAFTA case? Let me start with you, Chris Sands, again. Can we borrow from learning from other parts of the world and apply to the NAFTA area?
I have to say, I'm always a little worried about it. I think you heard that from Stephen this morning too, because sometimes the easy comparison with Europe, say, well, Europe is maybe a model for us, is as counterproductive as it is productive. Because there are a lot of people who look at Europe and say, well, they do some things well, but sometimes they're even more bureaucratic, it's even more weighted down, where's the accountability? Then you look at Asia, and Asia does some things well in terms of their ability to move product, but then they have some deficits as well. So I think North America can learn through the transmission of ideas, best practices from business globally, rather than from regions, if that makes sense. And it's not to denigrate the way but good policies made locally to fit local conditions, but companies that are operating globally can say, we've got this great experience in the port at Hong Kong or Singapore. They really move containers well. Wish we could do that at Seattle-Tacoma, because containers are a big thing for us. Or people say, well, we've looked at the way rail has worked in Europe, and we think if we could do more shipping by rail, it's not only more greenhouse gas friendly, but it would also be something nice, but we need more North American, sort of north-south corridors for rail. I mean, those are, but it's business that says, well, it's worked here real well the other way, and maybe we can take that someplace else. And I think people will say things like the smart port here that you're doing, Chris, will say, that's a great idea, but we ought to have one on the East Coast, maybe in Baltimore, and what can we do, further west, and just take those best practices and migrate them. But it's sometimes the hardest thing to pass that message on, except if somebody can say, I've experienced it. And that's where business can really be useful, saying, we've seen it, it's worked for us, can we take this idea and make it work for us here?
Alex, would you like to comment?
Well, I agree with Chris. I think that the lessons are and competitiveness indices are bottom up. No, companies are the ones that we have to look at rather than regions. However, government involvement is also of importance, and it comes to my mind a case of European fisheries, fishing cooperatives that were totally atomized ones, and there is this project PIFA. And so you know that you have to ship fish, fresh fish, from north to south, where the consumption takes place. And bourses, or trading fish, was also atomized in the past between Dover, Hamburg, I don't remember the other place, Rotterdam, I think. And what this project did was to put computers in the barges, in the fishing boats, create a pan-European agency to clear the prices and the type of consumption and the quality of the fish, and along with shippers, specialized cargo, specialized shippers, they expanded the market. And so thanks to this technology, thanks to this cooperation, the prices were less volatile, the consumption was satisfied, classification by quality of fish and type of fish occurred, and an expanded and intertwined trading market occurred. It is called PIFA.
Roger, from the business perspective, can you comment on best practices or your thoughts on this topic?
Well, I agree with Chris's comments pretty much across the board. There are things that we can take from the European model, the freedom of the borders and lack of tariffs and lack of non-tariff barriers to trade, and a lot of those things that could be better in North America. But I think it's important that this discussion continues to take place and that we make sure and keep it in the proper perspective. I mean, we've talked about the issues, we've talked about security, we've talked about costs, we've talked about all of the problems, but what we really have to remember, above all, NAFTA has shown all the protectionists, all the special interests, all the media, all the pundits who said jobs would leave and that trade would collapse, they're dead wrong. So I think our goal needs to be, NAFTA needs to become best practices and the rest of the world needs to learn from us, because we can do that. If we can get industry and government to work together, and there's no reason why we can't, in many instances it's already happening. The National Customs Brokers and Forwarders Association of America, the COAC Council, the Northern Border Coalition Group. There's a lot of groups that are working together to make this all happen. And we have to keep this in perspective. For all the problems that NAFTA has, it's been an absolutely fantastic program. And will continue to be. So if we're going to put that, put a message out to the rest of the country or the world or to students or to anybody else, that's the message we need to send them. This is working. Now let's figure out how to make it even better, because it is. I mean, trade is as robust as it's ever been given the economic conditions and the economic status. And while there's problems at the border, there isn't a crisis anywhere. It's all getting better. And these things are doing, and quite honestly, I'm not John Lennon and I'm not an idealist, but the truth of the matter is integration of economies into a global economy and is probably our only hope for true peace. And forging a coalition that will trade with each other and become so dependent upon each other that any attempt to disrupt that by anybody becomes a common affront is our only hope. So keep it in perspective and understand this is a good thing, folks, and there is hope in the world. It's not all doom and gloom by any stretch.
Please, Chris. Thank you. All right.
He looks like Lennon. Just a quick comment, I think, to Ron's comments about wanting to hear from constituents. I think the problem is the constituents that really you need to hear from have their head down doing business, and they're reacting to government's responses versus proactively dialing. And Roger mentioned a couple of groups that are doing it differently. I think if you let the industry drive the self-regulation forward, as we said earlier, you'll start to see some of these things resolve themselves. And trade is right. We just finished a regional freight study in the Kansas City region, and the projected fastest growth moving forward is U.S., Canada, Mexico trade in this region. It's still true. It's still happening. And I think that business proactive approach is what we need versus normally the reaction to what a government regulation or security policy is coming in place. General McCafferty was here in Kansas City a while back, and he said that the heightened discussion about the security of the drug issues at the border are the only positive thing about that is we're finally paying attention to a most critical trading partner to the south of us and getting into dialogue. You know, it's unfortunate what's happening, but it's causing people to rethink that trading partner that we somewhat take for granted. So.
Okay. Roger, your point really resonates with me because I teach and I deal with lots of students, and so NAFTA often comes up in the debate. Your point resonates in the sense that it's like a call to action. What can we educators, business folks, citizens do to highlight the positive aspects of NAFTA, the positive side of the story, so that we can move forward on security and on some of these trade issues? I'd like to hear from all of the panelists on this topic. Please, let's start with Ron.
Well, my political party, or the party that I belong to in Canada, the New Democrats, when the whole discussion came forward with regard to NAFTA and how we were going to work with our partners to the south, we're totally against NAFTA. And yet, I'm very supportive of NAFTA. I believe NAFTA has worked, and I think people have also changed their views over time on NAFTA. It's not perfect. We've had issues related to softwood lumber and all kinds of other issues. We understand that. But, you know, overall it has worked. And for us, it's where do we go with NAFTA 2 and so on? Because when we heard the discussions, and talking to my political colleagues in Mexico, when you were having your presidential election, there were conversations that had come up about, do we scrap NAFTA? And it certainly made a lot of people in Mexico nervous, and it made a lot of people in Canada nervous with regard to where are you going. And I believe it's shown through the Obama administration there is no intent to scrap NAFTA, I believe. And that is very, very positive as far as I'm concerned. But we have to build on it. It's there, it's a great framework, it's a great building block, but we have to do more with regard to NAFTA. Just to touch on, if I might, I had a comment to make with regard to, do we learn from other countries? I believe there is always something to learn. But just recently I heard of in China, for example, I mean, we have democratic elected governments in Mexico and the United States and Canada. In China, when they want to move a neighborhood of 100,000 people to expand their container port, they just tell them to get out. Find someplace else. I would be really interested to see if any governments in Canada, the United States, or Mexico would be able to just say, get out to 100,000 people and tell them to move in Kansas City because you want to expand some container area. So there are some challenges on that side of it because some countries can do whatever they want. And yet we have a democratic system here. Just to continue on NAFTA just quickly, we have organized labor also as an equation with regard to NAFTA. And it is a challenge because when you see a lot of jobs being lost in the auto industry and so on, I think all of us maybe have relatives that either work for GM or know people that work in the automotive industry or sell cars or are mechanics and how they've been impacted by this. So I believe we all understand how important it is to work with different segments of industry in our country. You can't, we just can't steamroll through just because NAFTA, and I agree, NAFTA does work, and it is working. We have to be very cognizant of the fact that, people are they're afraid with what's going on in the economy in North America today and around the world, and we have to be willing to take a look at all sides of the issues with regard to that. But I would agree totally that NAFTA has worked. It can be improved. It's not perfect. And I'm really pleased to hear that the United States wants to continue with NAFTA. And I know that George, I think George Rio is still here from Chicago, our consulate in Chicago, George. And I know that we had a great discussion in Chicago a number of months ago with regard to all the issues related to NAFTA and the kind of things that George and that office, our consulate, hears all the time with regard to trade and security and how important it is to build on those kinds of things. And but I would say from Manitoba's perspective and Canada's, I can't speak for Canada, obviously the government of Canada, but for Manitoba, it's really encouraging to hear, I'm a politician, so on the political side, hearing politicians in Mexico and the United States and Canada wanting to work a lot closer together and to improve NAFTA and make it better, and not necessarily look at what other countries have to offer necessarily, but have a made and built in North America way of doing business, and maybe learn from other countries, yes, but we also do business differently here in North America.
Go ahead, Roger, please.
Yeah, I want to answer your question.
Yeah.
But I think it's very important, because I think it's important that every one of us take some message back to, whether it's students. I was explaining, we hire a lot of people out of college and find them very unprepared for the international arena. But what is it that we need to tell them all? We need to tell them that they are citizens of North America. We need to tell them that it's their personal responsibility as a citizen of North America to find a way to build the consensus for industry and security and government to live together. And if we can't negotiate in North America and carry on diplomacy in North America, we sure as hell aren't going to deal with Afghanistan or Iran or North Korea. Mm-hmm. And so what we have to send the message is personally responsible people that are graduating from our institutions, that are running businesses, that are in there, have the responsibility to educate themselves, to educate others, and to educate their politicians as to what really has to take place in order for free trade and security to work together. We have to be able to tell every citizen of our country that's growing up, that's going to be in the next generation that, or it's only going to be as good as what we can do. And quite honestly, I've got enough gray hair. I'm not going to be around that much longer. They've got to do it. And it's up to us to educate them to that fact. It's not about us. It's about them. And it's not about them. It's about what they can do for the others. And when people quit worrying so much about their own little vested interest and look at the bigger picture, then we might have hope.
Chris Gutierrez.
Roberto, a quick comment. I was on this stage about a month ago talking about international students and getting them involved internationally, and I challenged the group, and I'll challenge all of you. I think everybody in this room's job description should include visiting a school, high school, grade school, college, telling the students about what international trade is, what you do for a living, and why, as Roger said, it's important to consider it, to think about it, and be prepared for it as you enter that next phase of your life. So I think everybody in the room should do that individually to make that message made across.
Alex?
I can only add that two things. First of all, I come from Monterrey, and Monterrey, Mexico, is a capital of NAFTA-driven or NAFTA fans. So Monterrey has benefited from NAFTA a lot. So my community is very, very much supportive of NAFTA. Now, my second comment is for our students to look at least at the headings of the 20 chapters of NAFTA. And you will see how positive each issue is out of NAFTA. But I also want to say that NAFTA is not well, it is a set of rules, but as a contract, it is a living body. So there are new issues that have to be put on the table, such as energy, water, energy overall, including water, security, labor, dispute settlement mechanisms on a permanent basis. Because this is one thing that NAFTA created, that these councils or these bodies are created ex professo when there is some litigious stance across the three partners, and then they are dissolved. And I think that we have to move ahead and have a permanent dispute settlement mechanism.
Chris Sands, would you like the last word on this topic?
Sure, only to say this, and it's one thing that we've seen in integration experiences around the world, and that is that integration flows where there's trust between people. When I was doing my interviews, I talked to a truck driver who'd been coming to the U.S. for a long time, and he said all of a sudden after 9/11, it was like 50 first dates. Every time you came, you were starting all over, and you had to reintroduce yourself. So the trust had really broken down. We need to rebuild trust among ourselves. I think, Roger, your argument that, if it's a regular shipper and you know it, that should be the basis for trusting somebody as they come in. During the Bush administration, they attempted something that was mentioned briefly, the Security and Prosperity Partnership of North America, this grand top-down idea to try to integrate and clean up some of our rules. And Condoleezza Rice is famous in my book because one of the things she said about this when she was Secretary of State, she said, it's like an endless condo association meeting. Now, I think that what she felt like was, like we all do about the homeowner association, that they're a little bit, there's always some cranky neighbor, there's always some issues there. It seems very petty. And from the Olympian heights of the State Department, maybe that's how it looks. One of the things that we have an opportunity for with the current administration, and I say this, in all sincerity, the president, I think, comes from a background not of condo association politics, but of community organizing. And I think the thing that he's picked up on right away about North America is that you need to resolve the little disputes with your neighbors. Because if you don't, then the neighborhood goes to heck in a handbasket very quickly. And he has made sure, if you talk to your friends in Europe or in Asia, they will tell you, we don't see Obama enough. He hasn't come to see us as much. You don't hear that from Stephen Harper, who's seen Obama now face to face 8 times, 9 times. The Mexican president's seen him 6, 7. He's given time, his own personal time, which is finite, to North America to try to work out these problems. He made a real commitment to it. Mm-hmm. That's the beginning of trust. And to come around to your point, Roberto, I think that if that's happening at the top, what we can do as educators and what we can do in our classrooms is really try to foster in our students friendships with their peers in Canada and Mexico, because that's where the trust begins. And if they've gone drinking with not drinking, we don't want to promote that, but they've done assignments or participated in CIBERs with students in other regions, that's where the trust begins, and that's where the next generation of business will take off.
Great points. I'll turn it over to Stephen now.
Thank you very much, panel. Roberto, you were terrific. Thank you.